Да, это серьезный разговор. Но поскольку у вас базовое образование...
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
Тогда я позволю себе...
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Вот смотрите, с чего началось...
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from.
Откуда она взялась?
Where did Ukraine come from?
Российское государство стало
The
собираться...
Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood,
годом создания российского государства.
and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862,
Новгород на северо-западе страны.
when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
Варягов. 862 год. В 1800
In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood.
своей государственности и в Новгороде.
And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country.
В 882 году
In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's younger son,
по сути, функция регента
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
к этому времени пришел в Киев, отстранил от власти двух братьев,
He ousted two brothers who apparently had
членами дружины Рюрика,
once been members of Rurik's squad.
имея два центра в Киеве и в Новгороде.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
Следующая очень значимая дата в истории
The
России
next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Владимир
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизованное российское государство.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties,
Один язык,
one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape.
российское государство.
Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
Введение престола наследия.
But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons.
Чуть-чуть попозже, после того, как он ушел из жизни.
The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines.
Потом сыновьям по разным линиям. Все это привело к
All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state.
привело к раздробленности.
There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe.
Но раздробленное русское государство стало легкой добычей.
But the fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan.
Хан Батый пришли на Русь,
His successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty.
в Орду. Но часть суверенитета сохранили.
They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty.
Начало складываться единое российское государство.
And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow.
Оно начало
The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev,
к тому центру, который
began
складывался
to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe.
Его даже называли Литовско-Русь.
This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Составляли значительную
It was even called the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population.
славными.
They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox.
Объединение, уния Великое княжество Литовское.
But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland.
Уже в духовной сфере.
A few years later, another union was signed,
Священников подчинилось власти.
but this time already in the religious sphere.
И таким образом вот эти земли
Some of the
оказались в
Orthodox
составе
priests became
польско-литовского
subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state.
ополячиванием этой части населения. язык внедряли туда свой.
During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the
Поскольку
population.
они живут в Украине,
They introduced their language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians,
на окраине
that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians.
занимается
Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that a person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group.
поляки всячески
So the Poles were trying to,
относились
in every possible way, to colonize this part of the Russian lands and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights.
писали письма в
They wrote
Варшаву.
letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are.
Это было
The Polish
это
oppression
было
of
в 13
Ukraine.
веке. Это было
It was in the
было в
13th century.
14 веке. Ну вот, в 13 веке. Это было в 13 веке. Значит, и
Now I will tell you what happened later
дальше и назову даты, чтобы не было путаницы.
and give the
И в
dates so that there is no confusion.
1650, в 1600,
And in 1654, even a bit earlier,
чуть раньше даже, люди, которые контролировали
the
власть,
people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands
чтобы присылали к ним
addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
чтобы вы не думали, что я что-то придумал, Дима.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these
Я вам
documents.
отдам вот эти документы.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years
Не-не-не,
ago.
но все-таки
But still,
документы из архива.
these are documents from the archives,
письма.
copies.
Здесь письма Богдана
Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky,
контролировал власть в этой
the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian
Он
lands
писал в Варшаву,
that is now called Ukraine.
а после того, как
He wrote to
получил,
Warsaw
начал
demanding
писать
that their
письма
rights
в
be
Москву
upheld,
с просьбой взять их
and after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later.
потому что
Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the Pan-Russian Assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar,
часть древнерусских земель вошла
which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom.
перемирие было заключено.
As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654, a truce was concluded.
Мир с Польшей. Вечный мир, как тогда были.
And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed.
Отошла к России.
And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia.
Затем во времена
And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in
Россия
Poland.
вернула все исторические земли.
Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west.
Да, а вот
This all lasted until the revolution.
воспользовавшись
Before World War I,
украинизацией,
Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization.
в преддверии мировой войны, конечно, было стремление ослабить
Their
потенциал.
motive was obvious.
Было стремление
Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area.
люди,
So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared. All those, however,